Welcome back, you filthy exiles. So, also, don't look at this eye. Look at this eye. I swear it's not as bad as it looks. I just have a bit of an eye problem, which is why my camera is always in a different angle. Anyway, so GGG's released some patch note, I guess, foreshadowing for things that are coming in and being changed. I actually really like these changes, by the way. There are a lot of improvements to fix a lot of the issues with the game, and part of it is accessibility. Part of it is the end game. So in watching stuff like what Creparians put out and even experiencing the end game myself, some of the big issues with the end game is like the res scaling, and I haven't progressed maps like others because I was busy finding breakpoints with the warrior, because I've been hell-bent on putting together an easy guide to follow, which I'll be working on tonight for those of you struggling with the warrior in the first 3 acts. But basically, some of the issues with the end game sort of pertain to the scaling reses or resistances, which is not ideal. It just makes it unfun. One-shotting, chaos damage is totally out of control in the game. Whether or not you like it, chaos damage is trash. It's just like you can't see it. It blooms under you and you just instantly get killed in maps. It just like stops the whole flow of the game. And for those of you who like the challenge, well, the end game is a bit different, right? And people are saying it plays a lot like Path of Exile 1, and so it should. It's like Path of Exile 1.75, right? So, like, it's not gonna be like Path of Exile 1 with the zoomness, like, but there are busted builds that are doing that currently, but it should have an element of flow to it. It shouldn't just be like playing through the first act where you feel like you hit like a wet noodle. It should feel like you've done the work to get to power, and so you've unlocked that power and now you can blast, and that's why we call it map blasting, for example. Anyway, digging into some of the things that they're talking about here. So gameplay features, they go on to say, like we mentioned last week, they'll be adding the capacity to fast travel between checkpoints. So this wasn't added in the previous patches. I'm assuming this is much more complex than what we initially thought, but this was sort of evidenced in the last sort of patch sort of breakdown. If you want to see that, it's in the last video. Otherwise, it's just like on the website. I'll put a link to it down below. And they'll be adding many more checkpoints to areas. One of the biggest, generally at entrances and exits, one of the biggest issues with the game is if you die in the campaign, you then have to backpedal constantly. Now, some people like that. That's great. But if you want to progress to the end game, having to rerun a whole area, and because all the monsters respawn, you've got to basically refarm the whole area. And if you're already struggling, this is just totally painful. If you're not struggling, still just slows you down unnecessarily. And it's just a hurdle that it isn't really a difficulty challenge at that point. It's just like frustrating fluff, if you want to call it that. So they're also making the passive point respec cheaper at higher levels. This is one of the biggest issues. A lot of the times when they've been nerfing a lot of the builds that have been coming out, and for whatever their reasons are, it's either OP, too zoomy, whatever, right? Sure, fine. It's, you know, however they want to balance the game is how they want to balance it. But the biggest complaint that's turning players off is they go and they like build this crazy build, and then next minute they wake up and it's nerfed and it doesn't work anymore. Like, you know, for example, cast on freeze, or for example, a few others that have ticked around over the past few days too. And they're probably going to nerf a bunch more, and may not nerf a bunch more over the Christmas period, but things are going to continue to change. So they're basically saying that it's going to cost 40 to 50% less, which is about 25 to 30,000 gold, right? So it was costing above 50,000 gold to respec your whole character, which just drives people insane, right? Nobody, number one, you got to farm up a ton of gold and then sit back and wait for them to nerf your character, and then you got to respec it all again, which is just painful. So this is a good change, and I'm sure a lot of people will be happy about this. They didn't really come up with a good way to compensate players while they were making these balance adjustments, which I feel like is something they should have done, knowing that there would inevitably be broken builds at the very end of the day. But that being said, you know, this is a good step in the right direction, and I'm sure a lot of people, be it they'll be frustrated about what's already happened, will take this on board as a positive outcome. Now, Trials of Sekhemas. This is one that really sucks for warrior builds, and even like players that are like, the game is great as it is, right? Even they're saying in a number of instances that this sucks. Now, the biggest issue with the trial of Sekhemas is basically like this is Sanctum from from Path of Exile 1, right? And personally, I never liked Sanctum. When I saw this was announced on the announcement, I was glad that they put Ultimatum in second, and I think they've since patched that as well to make that a lot more achievable. But to me, this never seemed like a beginner entry mechanic. This is like something that's just totally irritating because it does not favor if you're a melee character. Like if you're a warrior, right, you're going to face tank stuff. That's just how it is. But if you get to that last boss in the first trial and you're not like level 38 or 42 is the breakpoint or roundabouts, then you're just going to have an overall bad time because you're not geared up enough. And this is like the story of Act 1 to 3. You are constantly starved for gear, and the content is actually, and I checked this, so it's like 40 to 50 DPS on your main hand weapon if you're playing melee in Act 1 to get through it. In Act 2, you need about 100 to 110 damage, like peak max damage on your weapon. These weapons aren't available at that point in the game. The average weapon without like crazy mods is going to be like, between 40 to 60 DPS in Act 2, right? So you're always going to be behind in the gear based on the zone that you're in. This is like artificially created struggle at the end of the day. It's not a skill problem if you don't hit very hard. This is the problem with at least the warrior, not so much an issue with the monk. If you go and have a look at quarterstaffs, for example, the baseline DPS on a quarterstaff in Act 1, 2, and 3 is much higher than that of the equivalent maces, which sucks, right? Arguably, you can stack armor break, whatever. The solution to get around it is just like slap 2 totems down and bash away until you kill the boss, which is exactly what I've done. And like with Act 2, you need 30 life regeneration at a minimum and 60 for Act 3 to basically just tank your way through Doriani without worrying too much about dying. Though Act 3 isn't too bad. So this is how Trials of Sekhemas feels. So basically, the honor system, if you get hit, you lose honor. This doesn't work with Warrior the way that it is. So basically, they're talking about honor damage now scales based on distance enemy. When in close range, you'll take 35% less honor damage, tapering off as you are further away from the monster. Now, this makes a lot of sense because range characters have a severe advantage in this mode. It was actually designed for range builds in the first place. Predominantly, that's who played it. And so things like shockwave totems and stuff like that in PoE 1 were the predominant builds that were being run in this particular mechanic. At no point would you take like a melee build into this, for example, because it's just not designed for that. Basically, Skitter Golems no longer use basic attacks and instead now just explode. Serpent Claws, Bar, and ambush attacks now have approved visual telegraphing and cannot be used from as far away. Volcanoes created by Rattlecage Fissure Slams now last half the duration. That's another one. You'd be like running around, just take constant damage from the volcanoes, and this would be really frustrating. So this is a really good change. It's not making the game easier, it's balancing the game, and that was part of the problem. And a lot of the reservations aren't about it being hard or easy. It's about the game just being in early access and requiring a lot of balance. This is inclusive of, making respecs cheaper. Now, Endgame and monster balance I really like. So generally the balance in Endgame was more punishing than intended. 100% agree. Like you just get randomly one clapped even at like T5 maps. So we've toned down the damage in a number of ways and disabled certain on-death effects where the telegraphing was not clear, as it should be. This is like the chaos blooms on the ground were ridiculous. So maps no longer have additional elemental resistance penalties inherently applied from tier 6 to 11 or on higher maps. This was ridiculous. So basically you would invest in your gear and then your gear would be outpaced by the map. So you would always have to be overcapped, which I feel is just like totally contradicting the whole design of Path of Exile, and it deters you from wanting to play additional characters. Chaos damage now scales less aggressively over the end game. Again, like 9 times out of 10, my minion build, like not my minions, but I was dying to chaos damage because it hits like off screen. And so you can't really see the blooms, especially if you're using things like, firewall. Critical strikes from monsters now deal 40% less bonus damage. Lowered baseline monster density of breaching counters primarily by reducing the frequency of the elite monster appearing. Disabled volatile crystals modifier. Yeah, that one was ridiculous. It was in Path of Exile 1 and you'd basically just get blasted in hardcore mode. They'll revisit it in future, but yeah, you couldn't actually see it travel to you. It would just like appear underneath and blow up while you're in the middle of a map in Path of Exile 2, so this is a really good change. Purple explosives created by volatile plants now deal significantly less damage, exactly what I'm talking about there. The Siphon's Flask Charges modifier on monsters now drains 10 times less Flask Charges. Again, you'd like walk up to a monster and they would just instantly zap your flask, and then you're like, oh shit. So yeah, these are all really good changes, and I'm 100% for them. Character and item balance. We've made charm modifiers on belts substantially more common and now appear at much lower levels. The symbolism modifier now appears at level 23 onwards, and of inscription modifier now appears at level 64. Electrocute is 25% harder to build up. This is understandable because this was being abused, so I'm not surprised by this. A new added lightning damage and electrocute cluster to the passive tree in the ranger and monk sections has been added. It is now more difficult to chain freeze enemies by reducing the amount of freeze buildup. Like, okay, that's fair. That build was being abused. So yeah, okay, fair game. The Hunter Talisman now grants +1 charm slot. The small passive skills leading up to it now grant the stat it formerly gave. The charm helper text has now been upgraded to indicate that you cannot have more than 3 charms. Yeah, so basically you weren't seeing very many people with 3 charms. It was almost impossible to get. So yeah, this is a good change because charms are actually really useful. Skills, skill and support gem balance. Since launch, we've unfortunately had to nerf skills that were far too overpowered. How do we define overpowered? Basically, it is a situation a certain skill is so powerful that players feel no method of playing the game no other method of playing the game is viable. Yeah, like everyone just follows the meta. But see, this is a counterintuitive comment because basically everyone just follows the meta anyway, because, you know, people just want to get to the end game and blast, right? Generally speaking, we are trying to do this in a way that doesn't make a build bad, but we can make mistakes. Ideally, any truly meta-shifting change will only happen at the same time as a content patch with a new league to play in. That's true, they've stuck to that, but they definitely have done it more with Path of Exile 2. There's only like a handful of occasions where I can attest to this actually having been done in Path of Exile 1. One was where you were able to 6-link squires. So, and that was fair game. You shouldn't have been able to do that, but it got abused all hell. And anything that players can abuse, we generally tend to abuse. But that doesn't mean they haven't been looking at underpowered skills and support gems, and they've got a number of changes planned that should improve the skills. So rolling slam and all shield skills in the mace section. Yes, shield skills right now, like resonating shield, which I was super keen to try, are hot garbage. Rolling slam, hot garbage. So basically, these are getting buffed up. Improvements to bow skills, especially the use of Generation of Frenzy charges. Improvement to bone spells and chaos damage over time. So the problem with the chaos dot right now is it's bad for bosses, but with this change, hopefully it makes it more viable. Improvement to various crossbow skills, especially those at higher tiers. Yeah, like Gas Grenade is basically the most abused crossbow skill in the game. I've heard like other variants of the skill from friends of mine that just don't perform at any similar level. It basically means like, why would you run any other skill but Gas Grenade? Because you know you're going to be able to blast through absolutely every bit of content with that with no struggle. Improvements have also been made to underachieving quarterstaff abilities. I want to see more made to mace abilities, but we'll see how we go. Alongside all the skill gem improvements, we've also done a passover of support gems. They've added 2 new supports and removed or lessened the penalties of many others, notably fire, lightning, and cold exposure supports. Yeah, people weren't really using that. Added the tremor support, which can be used to give multiple aftershocks to skills with the damage penalty. Added bidding support. This can be used to give more damage to command skills for minions. Fire exposure, lightning exposure, and cold exposure support now no longer penalize damage of support skills. They now have a mana multiplier. That's fine, it's a good trade-off. It costs more, but it does more damage. There are also some notable nerfs with a few of the remaining overachieving skills. Skeleton Arsonist, this was going to happen. Spirit costs now match the other 2 skeleton mages. This should result in a slightly decreased number of arsonists. Yeah, people were abusing this. It's exactly why I didn't run arsonists on my build, and I ran snipers because they weren't going to touch snipers. Nerf to damage over time. The damage over time component on very high levels of tornado on Vine Arrow. Pretty sure this was an issue with one of Jung's builds that he put together, but then I think he was using Rain of Arrows for that. These were never intended to be dealing damage themselves, but more so act as a way for other skills to propagate damage. So, yeah, like, you know, Tornado Arrow seems a bit counterintuitive to get rid of, but anyway. Magnetic Salvo now only uses your stuck lightning arrows as opposed to creating those created by your party members. That's actually pretty crazy, but yeah, that's still OP, and I think a lot of people are still abusing it. As they wind down for the holiday season, they wanted to thank you for the success. They could not have done it without all support. That's very true. Community really stepped up here. So they'll be taking a lot of a break over the new year. So that means we're probably not going to see any other patch note changes over the Christmas period, which is okay. If these changes are made on time for Christmas, I think the big one is like these item and character balances. As well, they're all pretty big changes, to be honest with you, and makes the game a hell of a lot more playable. But yeah, definitely keen to see what they do furthermore. I really want to see some changes to the first 3 acts around the unnecessary amount of time required in those acts. Like, if you're going to run like 5, 6, 7 characters, and I'm about 120 hours deep in the game, it is really cumbersome to keep running those acts. It's just like, oh boy, here we go, this is a slog. Not because of difficulty, but because it's just a slog. And some things are just totally unnecessary. But overall, I'm all for these changes. It's making me more and more confident about the game. I will be honest, I really just sort of felt like it was lackluster on release, despite like all the positive sort of, so-and-so. The way that I look at it is not what it is right now, but what it is going to be in a few months' time. And where I want to see it get to is, better balancing for those first 3 acts, making warrior a more viable option. Like, and I know people are like, oh, I'm really smashing through with warrior, I'm using this and that. Well, guess what? A lot of people aren't. And so I'm going to be putting out a video later talking about the breakpoints in the first 3 acts. Basically, once you get past the first 3 acts in Path of Exile 2, Act 4, 5, and 6 are pretty straightforward. Then you're on to mapping, and it's relatively straightforward at that point. It's just getting past that barrier to entry. It's not a skill issue if the game just isn't balanced well enough to be able to progress, because you've got to, going onto the market on day 1 on a league launch and having to buy a weapon with the exalts that drop, that supersedes your weapon, as opposed to what the whole idea of the game is, which is to get a viable weapon, versus like being a ranger that blasts the bosses in 2 seconds, or like a merc that blasts the bosses in 2 seconds. Warriors feel like they're sort of left out in the dark. And there needs to be a bit of love there. And that's not to say that they aren't strong. They get stronger as you progress, but the problem is right now it turns a lot of people off the initial progression to be able to get to that, Act 4, 5, and 6. Anyway, if you like this video and want to see more like this, don't forget to like and sub to the channel and the Twitch and all the rest of it. I stream most nights on Twitch, especially over the Christmas break. I'll be taking 2 weeks off, so I'll be streaming a lot of Path of Exile over that period. But anyway, until next time, I'll see you guys later and have a good one.